Draco Malfoy and the Mortifying Ordeal of Being in Love by Is This Self-Care? Narrated by S.E.P. Author notes for this chapter. I must begin by linking you to Dromioneisms and their gorgeous sim scenes of the story, the monastery, Theo's party, and the ballroom dance. The creativity. Today's update is a double as these chapters once again go together. I have never, in over 20 years of writing, produced a chapter closer as simultaneously hilarious and dramatic as this one. Chapter 33. Heroics. Hazards of. Notorious or Draco Malfoy was in love with his principal. Everything was not under control, and everything was not fine. Draco's harrowing realism made things untenable on two fronts. He therefore got out of bed the next morning with two objectives, both of which filled him with different kinds of dread. First, given that this was no longer quashable, equilibriumable, or remotely under control, he needed to speak to Tonks and resign formally from the Granger assignment. Second, having rid himself of the fetters of their professional relationship, he was going to go to Granger and bare his anguished soul to her. And, if that went well, he formed a vague tertiary objective involving snogging her to within an inch of her life. Also shagging her to within an inch of her life, but first the snogging. He was a gentleman. Draco arrived at the office that morning, morning-ish, to find Potter preparing to hold a WTF update. He asked Tonks if he might have a word with her after the meeting. She fixed him with an inquisitive look, nodded, then gestured at him to sit down. Potter was about to begin. As Potter enumerated a few of the WTF's limited successes that week, Draco rehearsed his speech to Tonks. He would say that he was taking her up on her prior offer to drop the Granger job. He would insist that Granger keep the ring, but remove himself from the assignment in any official capacity. He would suggest that Granger stay at the manor after he resigned, as it remained the safest place for her. Tonks would be well within her rights to press him on the wisdom of stepping aside at this rather critical juncture, and if she did, he would play it cool. It was nothing, really. Just a minor issue, hardly worth mentioning. What issue? Oh, only that he was, in love with Hermione Granger. Probably had been for a few months, currently writhing in superb agonies about it. Did Tonks have a bin in her office? He might be sick. Potter and Weasley were now presenting mugshots of suspected pack members. Draco's knee jiggled. If they could get on with it, it would be wonderful, so that he might accelerate this hideous confession and crawl away somewhere dark and lonely to die like an animal. Suddenly, the ring flared to life on his finger. Granger's heart rate hit a new peak. There was a wave of echoed panic, and then there was the burn of the distress beacon. Everyone was staring at Draco, who had leapt to his feet, wand in hand. "Granger!" he gasped. Now all rose, Tonks, Potter, Weasley, Humphreys, Buckley, Brimble. What is it? Where is she? What's happened? But now, through the ring, Draco felt only emptiness. His attempt to apparate resulted in nothing. There was no answer from Granger's ring. He didn't know where to go. He stared at his hand with slow comprehension. They've got her. They've done something to the ring. Disabled it or destroyed it? Swearing, Draco cast his tracking charm. A map appeared before him, upon which Granger's hairpins glowed. He ran through the locations as the worried Aurors clustered around him. St. Mungo's, Trinity, the cottage, the manor. There, said Brimble, pointing at a cluster of pinpricks off of Scotland. The Outer Hebrides. Draco raised his wand to apparate to the point, but Tonks pulled his arm down. Hold the heroics, Malfoy. You're going to apparate to bloody Scotland? Don't be stupid. Give us 1 second to strategize before we all leap to our gory deaths. Draco did not care about any gory death at the moment but Granger's, and preventing it with his own if need be. Potter and Weasley jostled for their wands, looking as wild-eyed as he felt. Tonks stuck her head out of the conference room and called for Montjoy and Gauguin. "Get up and get your arses over here." As Montjoy and Gauguin scrambled over, she asked, "Who was on duty with Hermione at the lab?" "Fernsby," said Weasley. "Humphreys, with Montjoy, to the lab. See what happened to Fernsby. Brimble, call in all available Aurors and DMLE agents. All of you join us as soon as you're able. I have a feeling we're about to walk into the werewolf lair." "Right." "Nearest flue is Leverbur," said Brimble, pointing to the map. They piled into the corridor towards the Auror office's flue hearth. Draco's heart thundered in his throat, in his mouth. As they ran past Tonks's office, a hulking figure loomed in her faux glass. Tonks flicked a V at the grayback. "Disillusion's on," said Tonks, tapping her head with her wand. Everyone followed suit and stepped into the flue. A confused innkeeper at Leverbur heard a gaggle of disillusioned individuals drop out of his hearth. Before he could so much as offer them a pint, they'd rattled his glassware with the cracks of their disapparitions and left. The oars apparated to the tiny island amongst the outer Hebrides that had glowed on Draco's map. They materialized onto a flat, green piece of coastline. There was no one to be seen. Draco was unsurprised. He had felt his apparition get forced off course by an anti-apparition ward. In his head, a screaming chorus. Where is she? Where is she? Where is she? Nothing whatsoever from the ring. He cast detection spells towards the center of the island as the oars girded themselves with protection and deflection charms. Things took an unfortunate turn. Looks like 300 of them, if not more, said Draco as figures lit up beyond. Bloody hell, said Weasley, at the same time as Potter said, shit, and Tonks said, fuck. Draco cast his tracking spell again. At this proximity, the spell was able to produce a more detailed map, which showed Granger in the center of the kind of bowl-shaped depression in the terrain, bound around by the periphery by a high ridge. Wards? Asked Tonks. The usual, said Draco. Anti-apparition and alarms, all along the ridge around the hollow. Tonks, she's in the middle of everything. We're going to need a distraction. Take care of the wards. Buckley, Gogan, you're the distraction. Draw fire from the western edge. Tonks focused on a morph. Through the disillusion, Draco saw her features grow smaller and her broad shoulders grow narrower. He was now looking at a disillusioned Granger. That's a dangerous game, said Gogan, shaking his head. Brilliant, said Potter. Potter, Malfoy, Weasley, with me, said Tonks. Tambling's infiltration protocol. We're going to get Hermione. If we can get her out altogether, we do it. If we can't, I'll take her place. You're to extract her before they notice the swap. Send sparks when she's safe. Then we can have a spot of fun. Draco set himself upon the wards at the top of the ridge. He disarmed a patch large enough for the oars to squeeze through. The disillusioned forms of Gogan and Buckley sprinted off to the left. From his new vantage within the wards, Draco could see the mess that awaited them. Easily 300 werewolves, probably the entirety of Greyback's remaining pack, the fanatics, the true believers. They variously stood or squatted, watching something at the center of the crowd. In the middle of all of them, strapped against an enormous boulder, was Granger. She still wore her white lab coat. Draco was seized by a desire to sprint in and begin cursing. His disillusioned wand hand jerked. Tonks caught sight of the movement. She pinched his arm just above the elbow. What's the matter with you? She whispered. You'll get her killed. Get me to her. Granger looked barely conscious. Her head hung. Weasley swore under his breath. How the hell had they gotten to Granger? She'd been at the lab. Draco desperately wanted to tell her that he was here. Something like 5 minutes had passed since she had turned the ring. The 4 aurors crept their way through the crowd, disillusioned, their heavy notice-me-not suppressing the werewolves' ability to perceive them. If someone did notice something, a double-take, a sniffing of the air, they were hit by a silent confundus or obliviate. As they neared the center of the group, they could hear Greyback's hoarse voice spitting out some gloating speech at Granger. Thank the gods he was stupid enough, arrogant enough to gloat. Should have chosen something else to cure, shouldn't you? Came the sound of his voice, even raspier now that it had been during the war. Do I look like I need curing? Look at me, girl. Is there something wrong with me? Aren't you going to say anything? Draco hadn't cast an unforgivable since the war. At the moment, the killing curse felt like a reasonable option. What cared he for his soul when Greyback's filthy hand was under Granger's chin? Draco was going to kill him. They had at least another 10 meters to go before he would be within range. The crowd grew thicker. Draco lost sight of Potter and Weasley's disillusioned shapes. Tonks was at his side. How long was Greyback going to gloat? He could snap her neck at any point between now and the swap. Greyback began to move away from Granger. It was a blessing and a curse. Every step took him further away from her, but also out of Draco's range. He walked through his pack, reveling in his victory, asking his men whether they felt they needed curing. He had a little healer here, for their pleasure. Carefully, the oars broke through the front line, and crept nearer to the boulder where Granger was tied. The distraction came. Tonks hadn't asked for subtle. An earthquake rumbled under Draco's feet. Then there was the sound of an explosion. Draco felt the heat of it, a searing wind across his face. It sounded as though Gogan and Buckley had invented an entirely new, volcano-scaled bombarda, and decided to take out as many werewolves as they could in the process. As the werewolves scattered in confusion, the disillusioned oars flanked Granger. Greyback, unaware of the company, pointed to the group of men. You lot, watch the girl! He sprinted towards the explosion with a snarl. How the fuck did they know where we are? I destroyed that bloody ring. How many are there? Potter and Weasley's figures advanced toward the watchmen to head them off, if needed, while Draco and Tonks completed the swap. Draco knelt next to Granger. in what looked like the wet ashes of an extinguished fire. He disarmed a few hastily cast alarm words. Granger stared at their approximate locations with half-open eyes. She had a split lip with marks across her face that spoke of blows. Something was wrong with one of her hands, broken or dislocated fingers, Draco thought, from someone violently tearing off the ring. His rage was heady. He controlled it. Tonks sat herself next to Granger. Her disillusion shuddered as she matched Granger's clothing. The watchmen were distracted, only occasionally looking towards their charge as they strained to see what was causing the eruptions at the other side of the field. Draco severed Granger's bonds and replaced them with illusionary look-alikes strapped across Tonks's chest. He disillusioned Granger just as Tonks canceled her own disillusion. Granger was pulled away from the boulder. Tonks slid into her place and tucked a wand against her leg. Just in time, two of the watchmen had turned around to check on the woman that looked like Granger. The real Granger, invisible, was limp in Draco's arms. Draco whispered gravitas penna. He slung her almost weightless body over his shoulder like a grangery sack of potatoes to keep his wand arm free. Two watchmen got too close to the boulder for Potter and Weasley. Draco saw their eyes grow unfocused as they were hit by a confundus each. Another watchman said something to them and received no answer but gurgling. "Oi!" he called to the other. "What the fuck is wrong with—" He was stunned. "Go!" came Tonks's sharp whisper. The remaining watchmen shouted in alarm. As instructed by Tonks, Potter and Weasley flanked Draco to accompany Granger out of the fray, drawing as little attention to themselves as possible. Draco felt Potter refresh his notice-me-not charm. They all cast a backwards glance at Tonks, hating to leave her so exposed. The switch had worked. The remaining watchmen took positions next to Tonks Granger, wands raised, but did not for a moment ponder whether this woman was anything other than the real Healer Granger. Another explosion rocked the field. Spells were now whizzing into the sky in the direction of Gogin and Buckley. "Are we sure none of us should stay with Tonks?" asked Weasley as they walked slowly and carefully amongst the running werewolves. "She's still got her wand. She'll confrigo our arses if we don't do as she says," said Potter. Draco would certainly not be staying. He had the most precious burden in the world on his shoulder, and his sole objective now was making it out of there undetected. Greyback's sudden death could wait. They were almost run into by a group of werewolves jogging towards the watchmen. Potter and Weasley cast a pulso, knocking them out of the way, then petrified the lot of them. They heard the watchmen shouting orders to look for whoever had stunned and confounded their colleagues at the boulder. "Shit," breathed Potter, sending another confundus over his shoulder towards a witch who attempted to investigate her fallen comrades. "Almost there," said Weasley. Draco flicked a flipendo at another runner who got too close. They were halfway to the ridge. From there, they could see Gogin and Buckley, and thank the gods the newly arrived Humphreys, Montjoy, and Fernsby, and a dozen other Aurors and DMLE operatives with them, who joined the clash on the western side of the hollow. However, the three Aurors' trail of petrifications and stuns had been noticed. They could no longer advance freely amongst the chaos. They were being looked for. Bursts of Finite Incantatem and Hominum Revelio crisscrossed around them, which was deflected whenever it was possible to dodge. Weasley was hit, disillusioned himself again, and entered into a scrum with 4 werewolves. "Blast!" Draco did not like this one bloody bit. "Keep going," said Potter. "He can take care of himself. We've got to get her out." At the top of the ridge, a line of men now stood. Behind them, a witch was patching the tear in the wards that Draco had made. Something about her face was familiar. Potter's hands found Draco's shoulder. Draco stopped moving. Potter was right. They were too badly outnumbered, and Draco bore too precious a burden to attempt a direct confrontation here. Another Gogin-Buckley explosion detonated. Draco and Potter turned and backed down the ridge, hoping to find a spot further on to open the wards again. They made the mistake of looking backwards towards Tonks. Greyback was beside her, surrounded by a dozen men, and looked to be preparing to rip her off the boulder, and gods only knew what. A Finite Incantatem flew in their direction. Potter was hit. Draco cast a depulso at Potter, flinging him out of the way of a sizzling curse. He scrambled down the ridge away from the werewolves that were now converging on Potter. The only advantage to their being so seriously outmanned in this fight was that werewolves couldn't disillusion themselves without risking hitting each other as they circled their enemy. Potter disillusioned himself again, vanished from sight, and got serious. His reducto flung Greyback's men away, with or without all of their limbs. Draco decided that Potter, too, could take care of himself and continued his desperate search for a quiet place at the perimeter of the anti-operation ward where he could put Granger down and cut his way through. He sent a Patronus toward Gogin and the newly arrived reinforcements, asking for aid at this end of the field. The Borzoi sprinted away in a silver streak. Granger stirred against his shoulder. You're all right, said Draco. I've got you. We're almost out. Wand, said Granger. Draco was loath to part was his. He spotted a petrified wizard and muttered, Accio wand. A stout wand flew into Draco's hand. Put me down, said Granger. I can walk. Are you sure? Yes. From what Draco could see under the disillusion, Granger was dazed. He looked towards the boulder where she had been tied. Oh, they've put it out. Of course they had. That would have been too easy, wouldn't it? Put it out? Put what out? Granger fell silent. She was healing herself. Draco saw her disillusioned hand cast spells toward her head, her hand, and one of her ankles. How many are there? Asked Granger in a weak voice. 300. We have reinforcements coming. We're too few. I'm looking for a spot to get you out the anti-apparition ward. They've wised up. They've put up a perimeter of men along the wards now. We're going to have to fight before we can get you through safely. There are too many of them, said Granger, looking about with a hopelessness that matched the one in Draco's heart that he hadn't dared acknowledge. Potter and Weasley had teamed up and were causing some rather strong turbulence amongst the werewolves. Further down the ridge, a curse streaked towards Draco and Granger. He threw a Protego to deflect it. The Protego was spotted. The line of wizards at the top of the ridge began a slow walk towards Draco and Granger, crisscrossing the grounds before them with hexes. Below them, a full-scale battle raged as the Aurors and the DMLE agents attempted to make inroads toward them. They were trapped. Fuck, hissed Draco. I need to make a fire, said Granger. No, you need to get out of here, not make bloody fires. Get out how? We're surrounded. Granger's disillusioned form kneeled to the ground. Buy me 3 minutes, and I'll make them regret they were born. The wizards approaching from above were now far too close, and too numerous for comfort. Bloody fucking hell, said Draco. 3 minutes. Also, he was going to make them regret that they were born. He cast a dense Calle Presidium over Granger, cancelled his disillusion to draw enemy towards himself, then got to work. Under the silvery ward, Granger lit her fire. The first 3 werewolves who approached Draco had their throats torn out. A vortex of conjured knives impaled the next 2, and anarchist arrows thudded into the chest of the next. Every wand arm raised towards Granger was met with an immobilis, and if Draco had time, the burst of a detonation to rid the wizard of his troublesome limb. Potter and Weasley were attempting to come towards him, but they were hemmed in by the crowd of werewolves. Curses were hurled towards Draco, parried, and countered with choking, rupturing, or dismemberment. The first unforgivable was cast, a killing curse just at his feet. The man responsible was decapitated. Draco was beginning to draw attention to himself. There were too many opponents, and more of them coming. He couldn't use his legitimacy, couldn't cast lengthy turncoat jinxes, couldn't strategize. He only had time to react. A curse reached the silvery ward and bounced harmlessly off of it. It should never have reached the ward. Draco should have deflected it. He felt the beginnings of panic, not for himself, but for her. His casting grew rushed, reckless. This was why some things were forbidden between Aurors and their principals. Another killing curse flashed towards him. Draco summoned a werewolf to take the hit instead, then flung his attacker off the ridge. Potter and Weasley managed to crash their way through the circle of enemies with a joint reducto that came to Draco's aid. She's doing something with the fire. Licideratio! Suffocatus! She needs 3 minutes. Well, give her 3 minutes, gasped Potter. To pulso! A pair of werewolves sent flying. They were replaced by 3 more. Suffocatus! Sindo! Said Draco, whipping a choking curse and a throat slicing toward 2 of them. Weasley hit the third with a ball of orange flame. What's she going to do with the fire? No idea. Expulsus Vecerbus. I trust it'll be spectacular. A dozen werewolves broke off from the scuffle below and began to climb the ridge towards them. Too many of them, said Potter, spotting the group. Shave down their numbers before they get too close, panted Weasley to Draco. Weasley and Potter positioned themselves defensively on either side of Granger's silvery ward. Draco hated to trust them, but with that crowd coming their way, he hadn't a choice. He disillusioned himself and clambered down the ridge. He cast 2 bombardas to soften the group up, and then, wand in one hand, knife in the other, he was amongst them. His wand met throats, his knife pressed into eyes and the soft spots under chins. He was disillusioned Whirl, whose passage was marked only by entrails and spurts of blood. Not a single one made it up the ridge. He clambered back to Potter and Weasley. The beginnings of the shakes were on him from imminent magic depletion. 1 minute, said Potter. Around Potter and Weasley, a small rampart of werewolf bodies had begun to form while Draco had been occupied with his butchery. Below them, Tonks, still disguised as Granger, was holding the attention of Greyback and his retinue. She was dancing about, wreaking havoc with explosions. casting Depulso at the ground to push herself away from them, and leading them on a merry chase around the battlefield. Draco watched her trip backwards and fall, saw with a thrill of fear Greyback loom over her. Then she planted a combat boot into his groin and scampered away again, dodging spells and cackling, and Draco remembered that she was a black, as well as a Tonks. Buckley had rejoined Tonks and was acting as a rearguard, putting up a defense of the alleged Granger for all he was worth. Greyback looked up at the ridge. He saw the silvery ward. He pushed his wand to his throat and in a magically amplified voice ordered his men to destroy whatever the fuck they were doing under that thing. A fresh wave of attackers came upon the three oars at the top of the ridge. They were in a storm of spells now. The ward was hit repeatedly, but deflected every spell with a metallic ping. Underneath it, Draco could hear Granger gasping out a long incantation. The fire flickered between the polyhedra. The new wave of attackers was fresh and numbered about 24. The oars shifted to desperate, back-to-the-wall defense, forming a triangle around Granger. Unable to do more than deflect, they used the bodies of the werewolves to absorb the killing curses that came their way. Potter was hit by something concussive that threw him into a group of werewolves. He cast a bombarda as he landed. The air reeked of burnt flesh. Draco felt a cutting curse split his neck. He fell to his knees next to the ward, clutching at his throat. Then felt the cult seal as quickly as it had opened. Granger. 5 approaching werewolves vanished from existence before his eyes. There were 5 worms on the ground where they had stood. Draco stamped on them. He felt the shakiness of magical exhaustion threaten him, casting as he flung a depulso at another werewolf. A large, glowing rune emerged from within the ward and floated towards a line of werewolves approaching from above. Draco heard a word of command. The rune dissolved into a fine golden mist. Greyback's men blinked at each other amongst the mist, then rushed to Potter's aid. Inverted ethics. Tonks Granger was doing too well against Greyback below them. He was a brutal duelist that few could go toe-to-toe with. Certainly not a healer who had last seen active combat 15 years ago. Greyback, parrying spells, his face a bloody mess, looked up towards the silver ward, at Draco and Potter and Weasley positioned around it, and finally came to realize that the Granger he was chasing, who was meeting every one of his curses with her own, was not Granger. He whipped a killing curse towards Tonks, who dodged it. "That's not the fucking healer! Finish her!" Then, with a rage-filled yell, he scrambled up the ridge towards them. The silver ward around Granger was beginning to flicker. Draco told Weasley to cover him, and panting, prepared to cast the exhausting thing again. Weasley was assailed by 3 curses at once. He deflected 2. The third hit. He went down. There were too many of them. Granger's disillusioned figure was now bent over Weasley. Draco heard a healing incantation. He turned to shout at her to return to the safety of the ward, but the ward had blinked out its last. Now, where the ward had stood, there was a fire. What was special about this damned fire? Draco could not say. A circle of runes glowed at its base. Draco knew just enough runic to read the protection magics there. Inextinguishable. He needed to cast the ward over Granger again. It was the only reason she hadn't yet got hit by a finite and been discovered. There were too many of them. He needed time. Potter said, "Look out!" and cast a protego towards Draco. It deflected a curse, but another followed it. Potter was hit. There were too many of them. A hex flung Draco's wand from his hand. Another curse flew straight towards Granger where she knelt over Weasley. Draco was too far to knock her out of the way. He had no wand. He had no choice. There was no choice to make. He stepped directly into it. He heard her gasp, "No!" Now he lay, a paralyzing curse upon his limbs, blood dripping from his mouth, in a living nightmare, as Greyback, limping and bleeding, ascended the ridge. The handful of werewolves, still under the influence of the inverted ethics rune, launched themselves at him. He pulled back in surprise, then fought them off with the help of the men behind him. "Keep the ones down there busy," he barked, gesturing towards the field. "I'm going to finish this. Where's the bloody girl? I know she's up here with these arseholes." Draco, Potter, and Weasley might ordinarily have merited a curse while they were down, but they held no interest for Greyback in light of Granger. An explosion of finite incantatum churned the ground around them. Granger was revealed, clutching at a wand with a shaking hand. She had just finished casting something directly at Greyback. The side sweep of her arm looked like she had activated a tracking spell. She, too, was spent. She collapsed onto her knees. The wand fell out of her hand. There was a stillness over the group as everyone waited for something to happen. It was going to be good. Draco, paralyzed, powerless, knew it was going to be good. It would be an enormous explosion, A mass transfiguration. Summon bloody Voldemort. Open the gates of hell. Anything. Anything. The fire burned behind Granger crackled merrily, innocuously, as though it was the byproduct of a random confrigo on the battlefield, and not the most dearly bought fire that had ever been lit. The werewolves looked at one another. Nothing happened. One by one, the werewolves began to laugh. "That's it?" asked Greyback, his long yellow teeth bared in delight. "That's what the great Granger did. So brainy, she made a fire." There was more laughter. Greyback slashed his wand at the fire to extinguish it. Someone else cast aguamenti. The fire crackled on. Below, Greyback, the sound of a skirmish made their way up the hill. Draco heard Tonks's voice, and Gogin's, and Buckley's. "Faster, Tonks, for the love of gods!" More of Greyback's men attempted to douse the fire, to no effect. Greyback spat at it. "Leave it." He turned to Granger. "When this is all over, little girl, and I've taken care of your friends down there, I'm going to roast what remains of you on your little fire and eat you." More shouts floated up from below. Greyback looked over his shoulder, then began to circle Granger. "We'll have less time together than I wanted, but I'm going to enjoy every one of your screams." He leveled his wand at her. Draco knew that stance. There was a crucio coming. Granger, blood-smeared, shaking from her magical depletion, stared him down. She was not afraid. Her scorn was magnificent. Before Greyback could cast anything, there was a shudder of magic. The fire behind Granger turned green. A specific kind of green. A flue kind of green. Granger smiled. Now there was a swishing sound. The werewolf scrambled anew to put out the fire. But it was being fed at the other end now, and it doubled, then tripled, then quintupled in size. Figure after black-clad figure whipped out of the fire and spun upwards, dozens and dozens of them on brooms, cackling shrilly. Granger's smile grew dangerous, self-satisfied, the kind a Nundu might smile just before it decimated an entire village. Shrieks of wild laughter filled the air. The nuns had arrived.